Well, hello, and welcome back to another Talk Tuesdays. And in this week's episode, I'll be looking back once again at a handful of the images that I made earlier in the year, this time from August 2020. Now, unlike previous months, I'm not going to be taking a whole range of images from throughout the month. And in fact, I'm going to be focusing in on a particular trip that I made down in over to County Donegal in the days where we were allowed to take trips. And in fact, even from that trip, I'm going to be focusing on one or two different scenes from that trip out. Now, as always on this channel, everything that I speak about is first and foremost about kind of is related to me. This is not me telling you this is the way that you should work. Absolutely not. Everyone has their own methodology. But for me, when I'm in the field, to really get that creative spark running, I need to be making lots of images. Lots of images with the iPhone, probably initially, then lots of images with the camera off the tripod, and lots of images then with the camera on the tripod. And I kind of know that the images that I'm making aren't necessarily going to be the final image that I'm going to be pleased with. Now, that process sometimes can take the course of a morning, or sometimes I need to be sort of going back to a location time and time again. But as I say, the most important thing for me is the making of lots and lots of images. I'm not someone who can go out, kind of compose an image on the back of the camera and then wait for the light. Don't get me wrong, when I've kind of worked through lots of sort of sketches and I get to somewhere where I think is actually going to work quite well, I can then be very patient waiting for the light. In fact, I love sort of sitting about once I've sort of really worked on a composition. But for me, the working part of it is taking images, lots and lots and lots of images. The interesting thing is, I don't really, as I'm taking those images, I don't really sort of consciously think about what I'm doing in terms of, I must make these images because this is going to build me up towards the final image. It just kind of comes sort of naturally. And in fact, when I get back to the home office, I don't delete those images. I don't delete them from the iPhone. I don't delete them from the main camera, because I find giving myself some distance between making the images and then maybe a couple of months later looking at that whole workflow that maybe led to an image or maybe led closer to sort of the vision that I'm looking for, I find really useful. And of course, with the software that we have today and things like Lightroom and Photoshop, we can use things like the crop tool and things to actually even explore sort of different areas within an image and see whether there was parts of that we actually missed as well. So what we'll do is we'll jump over to the screen. We'll take a look at one particular scene to begin with, see how we're doing with time, and then take it from there. So I hope you get something out of this, but as I say, this is really me talking to me more than anything. I use these as sort of little video diaries as I take this journey of photography. Right, over to the screen. So this is the first little scene that I'd like to take a look at. Down on a little stretch of beach quite close to the murder hole, and I love it down here because it's a bit of a nondescript. Everyone heads over to the more famous murder hole beach, but I love it here because you can get some lovely passing squalls moving through, and of course you have these lovely textured rocks. Now, as I said, what I'd like to show you here is how my own workflow in the field kind of hopefully gets me slightly closer to a final image, and hopefully even just looking at these 5 images, working from top left across down onto the bottom row, you can see that I was moving more from the wider view of the landscape right the way down to a more detailed view of the rocks, the waves and the patterns. So this was the first sort of composition that I was looking at, and my main thinking here was there was the potential that we were maybe going to get a little bit of light and a little bit of weather moving in the far distance, but that quite quickly became clear that wasn't going to be the case. My other concern with this image is this big sort of area of nothingness here on the bottom left hand corner. Now, as I said, I think in the field, and I'll put the link to the vlog up above, It was a very kind of slack tide, so these waves were moving in very gently. And the problem with that is that if you use a slightly longer shutter speed, this was about a 2.5, 3 second shutter speed, with waves like that, you end up, there is water passing over the sand here, but it becomes very sort of translucent and very almost muddy. So this whole area here of nothingness going on, and of course not a huge amount going on in the sky, probably meant that this wasn't really going to be an image that was going to stand the test of time. So I started to kind of look at things a little bit differently, and so I kind of started to hone in more now on the, and maybe you can sort of see that we're comparing these two images. The first thing we've done is we've started to remove some of that sky and bring more of the foreground into the main part of the image, and that's quite often what I'll be doing when I'm looking at a scene. What is the main point of interest? Is the sky the main point of interest, or is the foreground the main point of interest? And that quite often will then lead me to set up my composition as such, either removing or adding more of the foreground or the sky as necessary. Now, unlike the previous image, we now have this lovely sort of pattern on the beach. And the other thing I quite like is we're now getting a lot more emphasis on these lovely rocks. Now, albeit we don't have a great amount of light going on, but this started my sort of old creative sparks going, that rather than focusing, as I say, on the more general scene, starting to hone in more on the rocks and on the wave patterns. Now, in the third image, once again, we have removed even more of the sky. Again, it doesn't really hold much interest for me. And now we actually have, every so often there was a slightly stronger wave coming in, and we now have some lovely sort of patterns flowing out and flowing around. I think there's still a couple of things in this image that are problematic outside of the general lack of light. One, I think this area here just a little bit too bright. I think probably in post there was nothing clipping. I probably could remove some of that brightness in post. But I think something that I probably couldn't get away with is this area here. It's actually just for me a little bit too tight on the left hand side. But I really started to kind of, again, removing some of that sky, getting closer to maybe what I was looking to achieve. So now we have completely removed the sky. And that again is just something that I wasn't consciously aware that I was doing this in the field. It just became naturally. I was looking at the back of the screen, I was looking at the environment, and I was naturally just thinking to myself that this isn't working with the sky in it, but what is working perhaps is just some of those lovely rock patterns and the waves over. So I then started to focus in on just removing the sky completely and just focusing on the rocks. Still some problems with this image, again, outside of the lack of light. The fact that I lose this curve of the wave is quite frustrating. I'm loving some of the patterns that are sort of being developed in here, and this is an image that with the right conditions, the right light, I probably could grow to like, because there is going to be some different sort of wave structures being made. But this sort of, the fact that we lose this pattern here is a little bit frustrating. I have now though given myself some better space in the top left hand corner, and I've also left a little bit of enough space for the rocks to breathe up here as well. So now a huge amount of emphasis on the rocks themselves. If we compare these two images, you can see that it's kind of 50-50 in this one, 50% rocks, 50% waves, whereas actually what I really wanted to do was give a huge amount of emphasis to the rocks themselves. And at this point, and I just distinctly remember this in the field, that I started to pay more attention to this and to this. How the waves kind of, as they sort of dissipated, as they washed over the tops of the rocks, that sort of pattern, or that sort of look that they gave. And I thought to myself, if we end up getting any light, the textures and the colour in these rocks will actually make, I think, for quite a pleasing image with those waves sort of moving through. So we'd gone from obviously our initial image of the full sort of normal grand vista, right the way through now to focusing in on these particular rocks. So there's definitely an evolution. I can see an evolution there in that workflow, right the way from the grand vista view, right the way down to sort of saying, hang on a minute, I quite like what the waves are doing over those rocks. And that's certainly then what led me to this next phase of the images, which we'll jump back over to the screen and look at now. So with that evolution that I talk about, this is then where I really started to get closer to the image that I was pleased with from the morning. Now this is the straight out of camera aspect ratio, and this was really just now focusing in on the rocks, the light. You see that we've started to get some nice early morning light, and the sort of texture of the rocks and the patterns that the waves are making. And there were a couple of elements in this frame that I really liked. So I loved, again going back to that previous image that I'd shown, the waves kind of moving over the tops of the rocks and just how they kind of are making almost a little wispy sort of pattern across them. So I loved that. And I also liked how there was a little bit of a sort of flow, a little bit of a waterfall flow down here, and how we were getting sort of a little bit of a connection between the upper rocks and the lower rocks. What perhaps I don't think worked well in this image was maybe just a little bit too much negative, not negative space per se, but just nothing really going on in the bottom of the image. This was a little tiny waterfall, and of course as the water was accumulating, it was actually creating a little bit too much of a white pattern. Also not sure that this is bringing too much to it. Don't get me wrong, we have some nice light on them, but I'm just not sure. It leaves maybe the image just a little bit unbalanced, a little bit too heavy on this side, a little bit too light on the on this particular side. So maybe reducing sort of some of the amount of rocks that we can actually see here. So given the fact that I quite liked the sort of water flow down here, my next kind of attempt at getting something was actually to focus just on that little water flow itself. And again, there are elements of this image. This is not completely straight out of camera, but not a huge amount of processing done to it. And again, really lovely light. Again, love the flow of water down here, and just a little bit of those undertones of the rock shining through, and again a little bit of the rocks coming through here. Love this here, just again that almost translucent nature just of the light, the texture coming through, the use of a polarizer really helping here. So there were certainly elements of the frame that I liked here, but what we've lost in this particular frame is all of this. We have a little bit of it here, but I really liked this element of the frame. And so while I was focusing in on the waterfall itself, we were losing a lot of what was going on, what was good about the frame up here. But you can see now that I have removed a lot of that sort of rock up here, just using it as a little bit of a framing element. That then led me to the final image, which was actually my favorite image of the whole morning. And this now brings in a lot of the things that I've been working on through the course. So this is probably over the course of about 90 minutes in the field. And again, it's bringing together those elements that I really liked. We've completely removed all feeling of where we are. There was no point in going for the wide vista view here. Looking at that initial wide vista view, I started to focus in on the tones of the rocks, the lovely sort of shimmer, the lovely sort of mist that the outgoing tide and the movement of the tide was actually making. And I think we've now sort of brought that together with, of course, we have some lovely light. So we now have that element of the misty water over the rocks with just that lovely early morning light shining through. We now have a lovely sort of, again, just we see a lot more of that rock coming through, and again, I think it just stops our eye from moving out of the frame too much. I really like this little arc of the waves of the water down below, and we just have a little bit of a hint of that water flow down here. And so this ended up being my favorite image from that little set. But I don't think I could have got to this point if I had have simply just thought, right, I'm going to go in and I'm going to just focus in on shooting the waves and the rocks. I think for me personally, I needed to start off with that larger vista view and go through my whole workflow until I ended up with something that is quite pleasing. Well, there you go. My own little evolution of an image out in the field. Now, there were a lot more images that I made that morning. I just thought I would pick little sort of sections just to save on time. But hopefully it gives you a little bit of an insight into how I personally work. And again, that's the important thing, how I work. I need to make images like this. And not only do I need to make images like this throughout my sessions, I need to come back to the home office and actually work through them. And speaking of working through images, one of the things that I'm really hoping to do with some of these kind of workflows is start printing them out and actually start using a physical journal. I put a couple of messages out on Twitter and I got a couple of useful links back about the types of books that people are using. I'll be really interested if you're doing any sort of journaling with your images or your artwork, what sort of media you're using, what books and things you're using. I find the whole process of going back through a shoot or a series of images from maybe a number of days really, really useful. It allows me to not only sort of see what I was thinking in the field and hopefully maybe learn from that, but also be able to look at particular images and maybe using, as I say, the crop tool in Lightroom, maybe hone in on some other areas of an image that maybe I missed in the field as well. I say this is all a complete learning process. And I think there's also something very important about the whole process working towards an image. And I've mentioned this before, the older I get, the more I really do believe in serendipity. I found this article a couple of months ago and I sort of shelved it away in the archives and I came across it again whenever I was putting together this vlog, and it is about notebooks and journals from artists. And there's one particular, I'll put a link to it below, there's one particular paragraph that's I found really resonated with me, and it was from Dan Eldon, who is another artist, activist and photojournalist, and journals were a huge part of his life. And I'm just going to read from the paragraph itself. With so much work nowadays created digitally, we can easily lose sight of our trajectory, and there's even a tendency to delete all trace of the creative journey as the fixation centers on the final product. But often the most interesting work is in the journey itself. And that really did resonate with me, because I really do find such interest in the whole process, not just that final image. And I think if I just go out, I think this is one of the reasons why I'm really starting to enjoy, and I think you're going to start seeing this on the channel, certainly as we roll into the new year. I think it's one of the reasons why I really enjoy the project versus the single image. The whole creative process. A tendency to delete all trace of the creative journey. How often do we hit the delete key on all those images in our Lightroom, on our phone? Now that is a huge part of our creative journey, and it's a huge part of my creative journey, and I'm so glad I have a whole bunch of images to look back on and really sort of see my creative journey developing. Well, given the fact that we're approaching 20 minutes, I believe, we won't do any other images, but hopefully you find this useful in some aspect. As I say, first and foremost, I want to find these useful for myself, and I really find it useful this morning going back through those particular images and looking at my own particular workflow. But as always, thanks a lot for watching. On Friday, I believe we will be out in the field somewhere along the Causeway Coast. I think we're out at White Rocks on Friday. I think that's the case. But until then, as always, thanks for watching, and until next time, take care. Bye-bye.